So in today's video, I'm going to talk about the case study of Ukraine. We're going to be talking about the challenges to sovereignty and its territorial integrity. This is for the A-level OCR geography specification power and borders, where you need to have a case study of a country in which there has been challenges to the sovereignty. I'm going to look at those in terms of the causes and challenges for the Ukrainian government. I'm going to look at how that challenge to sovereignty has impacted the people and how it's also impacted the places in Ukraine and around it. So a bit of background is the Ukraine was part of the USSR, the Soviet Union, until 1991, where it gained independence, became a separate sovereign state. This was seen as a huge blow to the superpower image of the USSR, now Russia, because it was seen as moving away from the USSR and moving slightly closer to West, and the fact that the USSR was losing power over some of its territories after the fall of the Berlin Wall. There's lots that's gone on in terms of issues going on in Ukraine, but since 1991, the major big incident happened in 2013, where there was a crisis, a huge challenge to sovereignty, which we're going to explore. But we need to know a bit of a background about what were the underlying causes and challenges to the Ukrainian government that led up to 2013 being the turning point. So one of the big issues about Ukraine is its geographic position. It is halfway between Russia and Western Europe and the EU countries. This is a big problem because Ukraine is such a big country. There are certain parts of it that are closer physically to Europe and other bits that are closer to Russia, and therefore they align themselves depending which they are closer to. So we can see there's a big divide in terms of language and political division. The Ukrainian speaking West, in which Kiev, and then we've got the East, which is much, much closer to Russia, and lots of people there are Russian speaking. We can see Crimea here is almost entirely Russian speaking. One of those, the reasons is because Crimea actually used to be part of Russia until the 1950s, but then was given as a gift by Russia to try and make Ukraine and Russia closer together. So we've got geographic issues, we've got political and language issues, we've also got issues of ethnicity. Most of Ukraine is made up of Ukrainian people in terms of ethnicity, but there's also a large Russian presence. So there's a large group of people that are closer to Russia, and therefore they're going to probably agree with lots of Russia's ideas, and so there's a bit of separatism in the country that, once ignited, could turn into a big issue. The other big issue is that since independence, Ukraine has struggled to have a common national identity, and its state apparatus in implementing its sovereignty is quite weak. So there's lots of issues of corruption, some government policies that haven't gone down very well. There's been some serious demonstrations, which we're going to look at in slightly more detail later on. And there's even the idea that they've had fair elections, which some people believe have actually been rigged or biased. And so you don't have a lot of trust in the government, in the opposite of those Nordic and Scandinavian countries, where the trust in the government is very, very, very high, and therefore they have a very stable sovereignty over their people. Some of the issues that Ukraine has been working on but still need reform. It needs a legal system that can deal with smuggling and corruption. It's very dependent on Russia for energy in terms of gas, so it needs to have better independence. The electrical system isn't completely transparent, so it needs to work on that. It needs to have better control over its police and armed forces, and the welfare system is quite weak. It needs strengthening in terms of healthcare and education. What we see here is not only is there potential divides in the country, ethnically, politically, but also the state apparatus that's holding it all together needs a lot of reform. It's very, very weak. And the tipping point for that was in 2013. The Ukrainian government had been making a deal with the EU to become closer by making a trade deal with the European Union. but they actually stopped the talks midway and then decided to move closer towards Russia, so started to make more trade and economic links with Russia. This was alleged that Putin had kind of forced this a bit, but this move by the Ukrainian president at the time was not taken very well by the people. They saw it as the sign of a very corrupt and incompetent government and not reflecting the views of the people that actually lived in the country. So it led to nationwide protests, a period called Euromaidan. Here's some protests that were actually in Kiev, the capital. And these protests were very violent. There was barricades in the street, and they actually ended up forcing the president out of power, and he ended up fleeing to Crimea, which we're going to talk about in a second. These clashes, as I said, were very violent, and there was a protest between the government forces and the protesters. Some people died in it. It was, an example where the state apparatus couldn't control the people, and it was one of the first kind of major challenges to sovereignty. This is the real turning point where we see there's parts of Ukraine that wants to be closer to Europe and NATO and the West, and the other side is Russia wants to stop this. They don't want that to happen, and there's some parts of Ukraine, these people that are Russian speaking, that are ethnically closer to Russia, that want to be closer to Russia and definitely don't want to see a move towards Europe. So we get this divide happening, which is triggered in 2013 based on underlying problems within the country. So Putin doesn't react very well to these revolutions of dignity. He sees it as a fascist coup by Western-backed forces, saying that the protesters were backed by forces in the West because they wanted to be close to Europe. And so what he decided to do was essentially take over Crimea. He annexed it, which means to separate out, and claimed it as Russian sovereign territory. The president, who'd been kicked out of Ukraine, came to Crimea and kind of joined up with Putin, and they assumed that Crimea was now part of Russia. So this is a breakdown of the territorial integrity of Ukraine, because Russia are trying to interfere in the domestic affairs of Ukraine, but they're also now trying to change the borders and claim back territory as Russian sovereign territory. Not only was there Crimea being annexed, but then Putin decided to start supporting some of the ethnically Russian and pro-Russian people in the east of Ukraine. And so now we have a military conflict happening there, where you've got Ukrainian forces from the government who are fighting against these separatists, people who want to be closer and part of Russia, who are funded and supplied by Russian money and military arms. So now we've got lots of conflict happening on, and this obviously has big consequences for the people and places, especially in this eastern area, which we call the Donbass region, and the big place in Donbass is called Donetsk. So some of the big impacts on people: 1.47 million internally displaced people from that war zone in the east. They moved to other parts of Ukraine. 600,000 migrated to neighbouring countries, lots of them actually going to Russia. And there was a significant amount of deaths, 7,000 deaths and nearly 14,000 injuries in the fighting in that eastern area particularly. By 2020, that death's gone up to 13,000. And since the conflict's gone even further, that death count has gone up. It's obviously been quite hard to track exact numbers. So some of these IDPs who had to move out of their homes obviously didn't get to live in very good conditions. Some of them were forced to live in summer camps and dormitories. The access to medicines and food and healthcare was very low, so their quality of life dropped massively, as they were essentially people living in their own country without a permanent residence. There was also some very big bombing and shelling of key towns. The town of Debaltseve, which is a big railway link between Ukraine and in the east of Ukraine, happened. They were like trying to cut it off to cause disruption in the city and in the region. Some of the big issues that happened in that town, because essentially it was cut off, was Housing was damaged. Lots of the services and like factories and jobs that people have gone to would have been destroyed. And there was nearly 7,000 people trapped in the city that when it got cut off. People living in basements, not with no power and heating and water. So the basic necessities for these people, their basic human rights, are being hugely affected by this conflict. And there's not much people can do to actually save them. No one can come in and actually take them away. So some pretty dire conditions for people living in eastern Ukraine. We see here Donetsk airport, a really important link to the outside world, and also in Ukraine got completely destroyed by the fighting. So any chance of getting in resources or aid would have been much more difficult because of this. And we see that this is a very important industrial region, and coal mines and chemical works were destroyed. Therefore, we're seeing huge power losses to the general public. Gas supplies are interrupted. Many of those gas supplies go on beyond Ukraine into Europe, so we saw big issues there in terms of supplies. And basic things like sanitation of the area would have been much poorer because of these damages. Not only that, but the economic output of the area would have hugely declined as the major industries were destroyed. Obviously, with all the shelling and tanks and fighting, there was damage to the environment. Some kind of weaponry would have caused forest fires and the burning of the steppes. So we got huge kind of after effects of environmental damage happening alongside the huge human losses in the major towns and cities. We also see other impacts on places in the fact that Russia, because of their involvement here, they actually got lots of sanctions put on them by the EU and the USA. And because of these sanctions, economically were put on Russia, which means they weren't going to trade. The ruble, the Russian currency, actually started to drop. So their economy started to do much worse because of this. We also see a reaction from global kind of institutions. So NATO decided to assist Ukraine by sending battalions to the Baltic states to essentially act as a deterrent. So they were in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland to make sure that Russia didn't try to make this into a movement into other countries. So the other kind of link to NATO is obviously this war was most significant in 2013, but fighting has been happening in that Donbass region since then. And in the meantime, Ukraine has been undertaking some practice military exercises with NATO because they're hoping to become a member of NATO eventually. And this very action of them just practicing with US and UK forces was enough for Putin to see this as a huge threat, that Ukraine was making the full move to being a European country, and so used it to justify a full invasion into not only the east and Crimea, but we're now seeing attacks towards the capital of Kiev in February 2022. And because of that, this crisis that started to happen in 2013 has now become one of the largest displacements of people in Europe since World War II. 7.8 million Ukrainian refugees caused by the conflict. So these challenges of sovereignty haven't gone away since 2013, and in fact in the last couple of years have got worse, and it looks like that's going to continue for maybe several years going into the future.